On my far right, we have David Conn, who is the sports writer for the Guardian newspaper. He has written 5 books, 3 books by himself and 2 ghosted. Yeah. Can't just 5. He was Sports News Reporter of the Year twice and Football Writer of the Year 3 times. And in 2013, he was Sports Journalist of the Year, and the judges said he delves beyond the glitzy veneer of modern football to hold the game's gilded elite to account, which is a lovely thing to have said. He's also done astonishing work on Hillsborough, which I won't talk about now because I think we'll get onto that a little bit later. Next, we have Rob Burnett, who is the online sports editor of mirror.co.uk. So he's from the dark side, a whole new world of newspapers online. He's responsible for the Mirror's online sports output and via social media and apps. He's helped make mirror.co.uk the 3rd biggest newspaper website in terms of traffic and won the highly acclaimed News Website of the Year award this year. Finally, we have Gareth A. Davies, who is a sports journalist for the Daily Telegraph, who specialises in boxing, mixed martial arts, and is also a very passionate, enthusiastic writer about the Paralympics. And it may be familiar to a lot of you who follow Paralympic sport because you are on television all the time when the Paralympics are on, every time I turn on. And also a little fact here, apparently you hate having your hair cut. So that is our panel. I thought the first thing we'd talk about, following on from the earlier talk, is the whole issue of the influence of a sports journalist and just how influential you can be on the sports pages, sort of tucked away at the back of the paper on a separate inside. My own experiences are that you can be hugely influential. When I started at the Mail on Sunday, I'd come from covering rugby and had become really very concerned about concussion in rugby, and we saw some pictures which showed a boxer's brain after death and a rugby player's after death, and this whole idea of being punch drunk was far more severe in the rugby player's brain, and it became a huge issue and something I really wanted to tackle. I think, like Andrew said, if I'd done that on my own, if I'd passionately blogged and all the rest of it, we would have got nowhere. But we launched a huge campaign in the Mail on Sunday and got it all changed. We changed the way they look at players in rugby. They have now to come off the field, and they're very aware of the whole idea of second impact syndrome, and that once you've been concussed once, if you go back on, there are serious ramifications. And the newspaper changed that. And I think you can have huge impact, can't you? David, if we start with you, what do you think is the most influential story you've worked on?
Well, you mentioned it just earlier, is Hillsborough, which I have to be slightly careful what I say even here, and we have to be slightly careful if we're tweeting stuff from here, because there's a new inquest going on right now about 20 miles along the road in Warrington. And I could go on about it all day, so we try to condense the story. I did have a part to play in the family's fight to get that new inquest. Basically, I first started writing about Hillsborough in 1996. I was writing a book, going back to what those kind judges said about looking behind the glitzy veneer of modern football. That's kind of like the glitzy veneer is the fun bit of football, and I did grow up loving football, but I found when all the money came into football that I didn't have a problem with the money coming into football. In fact, we who'd struggled through the 1980s loved the fact that there was money in it and that they were supposed to be they did make the stadium safe after Hillsborough, but there was a lot of issues in the way that the money was, in my view, being carved up, which I found really went against the grain for football lovers, football supporters. And in '96, I was writing a book which ended up being called The Football Business, about the modern transformation of football. And because Hillsborough had been such a catalyst for that, I went to interview one of the Hillsborough families called the Hammonds, Phil and Hilda Hammond. Their 14-year-old son, Philip, died at Hillsborough. And we sat in their kitchen on a working day, I think it was a Tuesday night. And I do tend to pride myself as a journalist on, if someone ever says to you, they were very, very hospitable, but I still massively overstayed my welcome. They probably thought that I'd be there for half an hour, and I was there for 3 hours, and they told me the whole story. So the whole story about losing their lovely son, and I could really see the anguish and the impact that that had on these people who lost their kids at a football match, but also obviously the outrage at the way that the disaster had been dealt with, which we don't really necessarily need to go into, but the big issue for them was that inquest, which they felt had been a travesty. And at the end, even though you're really, really glad as a journalist that you've massively overstayed your welcome and that people have talked to you a lot more than they intended to, it's always polite to apologise. And I said to them, you know, I'm sorry to have been here for so long. And Hilda said, no, because you're going to tell the world about it, aren't you? And that's why we've spent the time with you. And just to cut through nearly 20 years or about 17 years of what happened next, and I wouldn't say that I wrote about it day in, day out, because I didn't have the opportunity to. It was not something that the media was really concentrating on at all. But I took every opportunity that there was, and in 2009 was the 20th anniversary. And I literally got files out of the garage and just thought, I'm going to throw the kitchen sink at the fact that there is still a fight for justice here. So, and I got backing, as Andrew says, the importance of getting backing from the editors from the very top. And at the time, actually, the editor that really supported me on that one was Ian Katz, who's now the editor of Newsnight, who was a senior editor on The Guardian. And we ended up running a front page story. Hillsborough was a cover-up, basically, quote from somebody, and a big, big piece about what the main issues still were for the families 20 years on. And basically, Andy Burnham, who was then a minister, I think he was Minister for Culture, Media and Sport, we'd worked, when I say worked together, you know, I'd covered things that he was doing years before, and we'd known each other a long time, and he phoned me up and said, for some reason, that piece opened a light bulb in his head about Hillsborough. And he said, I'm going to call for all the documents to be published relating to Hillsborough. And lots of people have worked incredibly hard on that, and that did happen, and there was a panel report in 2012, and then that inquest was quashed in 2012, 21 years later, after the first inquest verdict. So I'm not claiming the credit for that, but Andy Burnham himself has said publicly lots of times that that piece in The Guardian was a catalyst for him to make that call. And now I've been covering the inquest, the new inquest in Warrington, as much as I possibly can. And we're really committed to it, to see that the families are hopefully for them, getting justice finally after all these years. So again, I'd just like to say what Andrew said at the end about, you know, it might seem like kind of hard work and difficult work to be doing something that's, you know, a difficult subject and having to be spending a lot of time on it, sometimes without much result. But I think you do feel like it's a privilege to be able to do it, and if it does come off and it's something important, then there's a huge satisfaction and again a feeling that that's what we're here for.
Lovely. Okay, let's move on to Rob.
Well, I think, you know, Davies is a great example of a journalist, as we've said, that gets under the skin of things. A lot of the time in sport, what you're covering is the fun stuff. It's the, you know, the enjoyment, sometimes the froth. You know, and I've heard the sports department referred to as the, you know, the toy room in the office before. But you know when you're on a really big story because the news editor comes around and wants to steal it for the front of the book. And one of those days that I had was last November, when Jules Bianchi crashed his car in the Japanese Grand Prix. And that for me was a really interesting one, because covering it online was extremely difficult. The newspaper, obviously, you know, there's a point in time when you have to go with what you've got with the situation. But we were covering it was a changing situation, and there was so much noise on social media, and it comes back to a point that's been made before about trust and being able to cut through what's actually going on. And we had our reporter Byron Young in the paddock in Suzuka, who was able to actually, you know, I was talking to him on the phone, he was telling me what was going on. He was able to speak to people there, bring us the real story, which we were then able to tell to our readers. And it was really difficult to do. I'm a huge Formula One fan, and I'd always thought one day I'm going to have to report on this. But it sort of hadn't happened for years and years. There'd been no big dramatic life-threatening crashes for a long time since Senna, really. And there was a sense almost that the sport had got, complacent's a strong word, but it hadn't had to consider this type of accident for such a long time. And Byron did absolutely great work out in the field, bringing the latest on it, but then also the follow-ups on that story. Tragically, Jules eventually died, but it has led to changes in the safety procedures for Grand Prix, the virtual safety car, different flag procedures, and so on. And as a sports journalist, often, as I say, you're doing the fun stuff, you're doing the froth stuff, but to occasionally get working on a really difficult story like that is, it does have the power, as you were saying. There can be, and bring those kind of issues to a different audience.
Great. Gareth?
Well, I've decided to, gosh, I'm very loud. I've decided to choose 3 events, actually, because rather like David, I've been at this quite a long time, and a very long time ago, back in '89, I really started out as a foreign correspondent, and I was out in China during Tiananmen Square, and it had a big impression on me at the time. I'd lived there and I got to know a lot of students, kind of got a bit bound up in the revolution, if you like, as it was at the time. And when I came back to the UK a year later, and luckily for me, I was able to get straight out of there. I had kids straight away, and so I kind of got involved myself, because I was always into sports, probably wanted to be a professional sportsman, and I got involved in the games and recreation department, as we call it. And but one of the things that I've always felt, and it's clear from what everyone else is saying, that even in your own small way, you have to try and pioneer. And the things that I was very taken with, first of all, in my career, was going to Atlanta in 1996, seeing a one-legged man jump 2 meters over a high jump, there being no other British journalists there from any other national newspapers, and thinking, wow, this is amazing. I'm at the most kind of incredible event on earth right now, and there's no one else here from Britain. So obviously, and I think I was crying at the same time as well, with joy, if you like. And I was taken. I was a Paralympic convert overnight. So I've done 6 of those. And London 2012 was a massive event for me, because it was the culmination of many years of kind of what David was talking about, but in a different way, Alison, in that you have to. There was a time where I had to really, really fight hard with a desk to get any space. And that's one of the things that I suffer from. It's an affliction in several of the sports I cover. A bit like this morning, really. I wrote a piece before I came here on a 3'7", 6-stone rugby wheelchair player who's playing tonight for Great Britain against the Paralympic champions Australia at the Copper Box. And he thinks he's Jonah Lomu. And they've stuck it on the front of the digital portal. They like it, but it's not in the newspaper. So some of the things that I have to deal with, because there's always more kudos getting in the paper. David writes kind of 5,000-word pieces. David used to offer 5,000-word pieces when I was running our school sports section, which was 400 words a week. And David would offer a 5,000-word piece those days.
That's why I had to write a book in the end.
Yeah, exactly. But because I've been very involved in school sports as well over the years, and I'll say a little bit more about that later with the Telegraph. The second event I would pick, London 2012 was huge. Excuse me. The second event I would pick was 10 years ago. It was a bit of plastic. A piece of plastic just appeared in my mouth. Apologies. 10 years ago, I did a big football story. Actually, it was. I think it was nominated as one of the sports stories of the year. Ferenc Puskas. It was called "The Plight of Ferenc Puskas," 2005. And the reason I highlight it was I was allowed to go and do an investigation for 2 weeks and went over to Hungary. And this was a guy who had been the Beckham of his day and had played for Real Madrid. He played for Hungary in the Soviet system, and then he'd defected to Spain, been one of the Galacticos playing for Real Madrid, and then had played for Spain, as you know, as well as an international footballer after defecting to the West. And I went over and did an investigation with an old Hungarian man who had called up the desk, and no one really wanted to listen to. He was kind of blathering on a bit like I am, and I listened to him, and we went over there, and it was an amazing story. And Real Madrid had given his wife, he was dying of Alzheimer's in a place called Volgi Hospital, and there'd been a charity game for him in Hungary, Real Madrid and a Ferenc Puskás 11, and they'd raised £1.5 million. And I couldn't believe it when I went over there, because his wife, who was kind of, you know, they were in love all their lives, and he was dying, and they'd given her, some crooks had given her 15 grand from the game or something. So we did this story, and it was quite big, and I think Sepp Blatter got involved, and all kinds of, it was a big story in terms of what it created at the time, and Real Madrid were hauled over the coals over it. So that was a very big story at the time. I'm not a big football fan, but it was nice to be involved in a big story, and I really felt the impression of when football goes big, and I couldn't really get away from the story in the end, kind of weeks later, because it went on and on and on. And the, I'm trying to remember the others. Oh yeah, Oscar Pistorius was a big story for me, because I do quite a lot of TV and radio anyway, but I really was so busy on that story, because I'd known him from the age of 16, and obviously that was a huge story in the world at the time, and it was a very tough story to work on, because I'd always found him incredible to be around, and it was the dichotomy of having lionized this man and maybe having been a part of creating a monster, if I can say it that way, because I'm convinced he knew what he was doing. I shoot guns on a range sometimes, and you only need to fire one bullet to know what you're doing. And I hope he never competes in the Paralympics, but I did enjoy his story and I enjoyed him. But I think, you know, what he's done, killing his girlfriend, was a horrific story to be involved in, but I was a big part of it, because I did do a lot of TV on it, and I was very honest about him, that I never realized that he was that kind of person and that capable of doing something like that, or had that much fear in him. And that the point about this for you and for us is that as a journalist, as someone that goes into people's houses, I don't quite stay quite as long as you.
I don't believe that.
No, I do. It's a privilege when people invite you into their homes. I wouldn't invite journalists into my home, and I'm serious about that. I don't like journalists very much. I'm serious, genuinely. I don't like journalists very much, and basically, I'd say that it was realizing that people portray certain things to us because they know that we do have that influence, and they can show us different faces. And I think it's a very important part of growing up as someone who's a journalist, to understand, you know, where people are coming from. And the other big story this year, because I do a lot of fight sports, it's what I mainly do now, and I'm very passionate about them, because I love storytelling, and most people who fight are great stories, like the Paralympians. And it was Mayweather-Pacquiao this year, and it's a digital story, because it was very satisfying for me, having worked really hard for many years on building a following for my work on Pacquiao and Mayweather, that we did 40 million views on the weekend of the coverage of the fight, which outstripped anything by, I don't know what the figures are, but you know, it was 10 times more than had ever been done, you know, for the telegraph, or maybe for any single event in UK sport. So, and that was very satisfying, and so yeah, so that's not one event, sorry, quite a long series of things, but hopefully a little bit of information in there that's useful.
One thing that's very interesting, I think, about some of the stories that have come out is the impact that a good editor can have, and the backing you can get, and how important that is. I know that
and
my
how
editor...
few of them there are.
Well, yeah, well,
good editors, I mean.
Good editors. Well,
yeah.
Although you could say that a good newspaper editor is absolutely invaluable, isn't he? And I think one of the differences perhaps between newspapers and the sites that come up without any history and aren't edited and governed properly. And I certainly found with the concussion campaign I did, I know that Georgie Gregg was talking to you earlier, my editor, and when I went to him and said, I want to do a campaign about concussion, and he looked at me like I'd gone nuts and said, really, how are you going to stop rugby players being concussed? I said, it's not about stopping them being concussed, it's making sure that when they are concussed, they come off, and having this conversation with him. And he knew that we wouldn't put on one reader with that story, but I believed in it so passionately. He just looked at me and said, if you believe in it, go for it. And we just did tons and tons of work on it. And I think a good editor like that will allow you to bring the good stories that aren't necessarily about readers, but are about changing things.
I don't respectfully don't agree that there aren't that many around either, you know, just in my experience.
Yeah, but you're doing football, and I'm...
Yeah,
that's
no,
what
I mean
think
generally in The Guardian, without wanting to, you know, big up The Guardian, yeah, on its own, I'm just talking about my own experience. I have found that there's a lot of really good editors, and they are really committed to good stories, and I do feel really lucky about how much backing that I've been able to have with, you know, a serious look at sport, if you like. And I think a key to it, and I presume it's the same for you as an editor, is you have to have done some of the work first and be able to come and say, this is actually a really important story. It's not just, I'm not going off on a, I don't want you to send me off on a jolly. And I think if we put the work in, we're going to get a really strong result. And even if, I mean, I don't really know how it works exactly, but my impression is that if you're saying that something like your concussion campaign isn't going to put one reader on, well, maybe not, but it's so much boosting the credibility of what you're doing generally that it must help the reputation of the paper.
I think so, and it comes to a point where these are things you should be doing. You should be campaigning, you should be investigating, you should be going beyond the sport, shouldn't you? And
you feel that in your bones that you should be.
The key in it, David, is the fact that you know, as we move into the digital age, it's where the place is for long-form journalism, really, and you've just got to do it. You've got to keep doing it. And it's persistence, and you know, you don't necessarily get the backing of your digital editor to go away and spend a week and a half or 2 weeks, you know, producing a 2,000-word piece. But as you say, campaigning online actually works. You know, campaigning with Twitter and all those kinds of things kind of work, and that's why you have to build. It's a building process the whole time.
yeah.
I think it's actually tougher. You know, long-form journalism it is disappearing from newspapers as well, and I do agree with you on that. That it's important to have editors who are committed to you doing that.
Right, we'll move on to slightly different subjects. Let's try rock. So, looking at online and the sort of the differences that you might experience for the rest of us. What do you think that Newsbrands can bring to sports journalism that other media can't?
Well, I think there's probably two key things for me. You know, as I was saying earlier on, that Bianchi story was a good example. There's so much noise, there's so much out there, there's so much information going around, especially with social media and so on. But there's two things that Newsbrands can bring. One is access. We, you know, you guys at the Mail, we at the Mirror, at the Guardian, at the Telegraph, you've got people, reporters embedded in all sorts of sports, in every football club, every big football club up and down the country. If an Arsenal story breaks today, or if a Manchester United story breaks today, I can call Dave McDonnell around the corner and find out what's really going on with it. They've got access like virtually nobody else, which they spent years building up. And secondly, and it's linked into that, is the sort of the trust and brand recognition. So in all the noise that's out there, who am I going to listen to? Who is telling me the truth about this story? And you've almost now got brands within Newsbrands. So David within The Guardian is a good example. John Cross for us with Arsenal, within the Mirror brand. You know, people know who they are. They work with they're almost a brand within a brand, working. They've got to where they are by being a great journalist, but also under the auspices of the organ, if you like, and it lends them credibility, which they are credible, and it cuts through a lot of the noise that can be out there. And I still think that is massively true. But it's also because most people that work in Newsbrands have come through. They've done their time. They've done their work on the Bucks advertiser, in my case. You know, knocking on doors, doing those hard hours, that slog, building up your experience. A lot of new brands might not be recruiting people with the same kind of experience, which definitely helps you later on.
And actually, what I know that the fact that we're online, and that online's taking over so much from print is a big challenge. I know it's got many different challenges, but in terms of actual readers and journalism, it's incredible the reach that you've now got. So obviously The Guardian was the Manchester Guardian, which we used to get when I was growing up in Manchester, and and that's one reason why I'm really proud to work for it, because we got it in the family home, and your fingers used to be black after reading The Guardian, and now it is a worldwide it's a worldwide brand, it really is. And I did a piece about Bayern Munich, it's 2 years ago now, and I did a sort of in-depth piece about, because the German model of football is really different from the Premier League. The clubs, even Bayern Munich, are owned by the member supporters. They're not bought by a sheikh or an oligarch or an American hedge fund type person. And I was trying to reel in getting exclusive access to Bayern Munich, and I was talking to somebody senior at the club who I met at a conference in London. And I said, I'm really interested in doing this, blah, 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 trying to sell the idea of giving them, doing a piece in The Guardian. And he said, oh, The Guardian, oh, of course, we have all heard of The Guardian. And, that really woke me up to the fact that, and the English media is massively important in football. So, for example, the FIFA story, which at the moment is my light relief farce and comedy from the Hillsborough inquest, and it's just funny, I mean, corruption shouldn't be this funny, but it is really funny, and Sepp Blatter is very funny, and Barney Ronay in The Guardian called him a butterball dictator, which I thought was an amazing phrase. But Michel Platini, who's found himself in trouble at the moment, he came over to us at a UEFA European football the European Champions League draw in Monaco, and we'd done the work and we were having a beer, and he was chatting over there with one of the big cheeses, and he came over and had a chat, and he was being really friendly, and we couldn't really understand it, and he said when he left, he said, you are very influential, you are the English media, because the size of the papers, the name of the papers, the reputation of the papers, but also the language of English. And it's not just that when we meet an Italian or a Frenchman or a Spaniard, they end up talking to us in English. What you realise is they all talk to each other in English, and it's the common language, and therefore the English media is hugely powerful and influential in a lot of stories, and especially in sports politics or anything that's international.
Yeah. Gareth, obviously you cover odd sports.
Yeah,
are they odd?
No,
but sports that perhaps
pretty odd at the moment, isn't it?
Yeah, well, yes. But you cover sports that perhaps wouldn't have been covered a few years ago. There's been an expansion and a widening of the sports we cover now.
I mean, you didn't mention polo. I do a weekly column on polo as well. I'd covered it years ago, and the reason I mentioned polo and UFC, Ultimate Fighting Championship, is that, this is crossing over into an area that really is very relevant to most people here, that we've been able to set up commercial deals in these sports with big sponsors. The Ultimate Fighting Championship was something I met some mixed martial artists about 10 years ago. I was already the boxing correspondent, and I really felt that they were kind of written about and talked about in the wrong way. I spent some time around them, and that their stories were extraordinary, and the way they trained was extraordinary, and I just found it fascinating. So
how were they being written about?
Just that, that they were cage fighters. That in the sports section it was, mixed martial arts, if you like, occasional piece. But in the news pages, if there was a rape or a fight outside a nightclub, it was someone who trained in cage fighting. They were cage fighters. And I just felt like it wasn't really being depicted in the right way. In a way, covering Paralympic sport was almost like an apprenticeship for doing it, because there's so many things that are misperceived in the way they're presented in the media, and that's the point I was kind of making earlier, that there's so much language of misrepresentation that is there all the time, and there is a lot of lowest common denominator. There's a lot of clickbait, there's a lot of clickbait in the media. You can't avoid it. There's a lot of clickbait online, particularly with the tabloids, and now we do it. Telegraph does it all the time as well. And so I just felt that I just got involved in this coverage of the UFC, and I had gone through this before with Aviva. They sponsored all the school sports coverage we did, and we got about 2 million quid from them over about 8 years. But it enabled me to get about 30 pages a year in the paper about school sports, about sale of school playing fields. It was quite interesting. Between about 2005 and 2013, I think it was. So it was weird because the pages were being bought as advertising pages, but my editorial within it was ring-fenced, and they didn't kind of influence me very much at all. We had National School Sports Awards sponsored by Aviva. So it was a kind of win-win-win-win-win for everyone. And the same, I had the same thing then, set up a similar deal with the UFC, where I had 10 pages in the paper a year where I just wrote people's stories, I told stories about them. And you know, they were fascinating stories, and they were worthy of inspiring people. And I think we've got the same with polo now. I mean, the desk or the budget from the Telegraph would probably not extend for me to write a column on polo for 400 quid a week. But because we've got sponsorship now from Jeje Le Couch, I now say it correctly as well.
Very good, very good.
Rather than JLC. That there's a market there for niche sports, which definitely have a following. And if you can combine it with writers or journalists who are able to have a foot in editorial and understand the commercial value of it, you know, I think it works. I mean, I will say I've profited from it, and it's enriched my journalistic career. I think I've been able to do very good things with it. You know, some of the Paralympic stuff I do now is sponsored by BT. It gets me a whole page on that person sometimes because they want their advertising around it. That's the way forward. It's the way forward online. It's the way forward in the newspaper. And I think it's really effective. The problem comes, of course, when, you know, recently, as we had with Peter Oborne, you know, with a kind of a very ethical decision, you know, a banking question, an ethical decision about economics or finance, and that bank has a sponsorship deal in the same way. And in that moment, you just have to make an ethical decision and be hard and write the hard story, in my view.
Have you ever had to do that? Have you ever?
Yeah, of course. You know, sometimes I've written a story in that ring-fenced editorial, not hammering, but having a go at the people who are sponsoring
paying for
it.
things.
But the good thing is it almost makes the debate revolve a little bit more. It's very interesting.
If they're brave enough to go with it,
exactly.
it often works out well.
And again, it's about relationships and trust.
Yeah.
They trust me. I've written about Paralympics for a long time. I can have a pop at BT about something, you know, and it's fine.
Yeah. Okay. David, we're talking here about sort of quite serious subjects. No one's mentioned any sort of sport, actual on-the-field sport at all. What do you think it is about sport that allows us to talk about these serious subjects within the context of, like you say, the games, the toy room?
Yeah, I think that it's again about the online expansion of the media, and also obviously in the case of sports on television, pay TV, and there being so much more sport on television. So in the print days where there was only terrestrial television, there just wasn't the space at all. And I feel that for all the things that I object to in the commercialised era of sports, which is really just about the wrong people being in charge and the money going to the wrong places rather than necessarily, although it's also about fans being ripped off because things are too expensive. But the bigger picture is that it represents a massive recognition of how popular sport actually is and how much it means to people, which I think wasn't really represented when it had 2 or 3 pages at the back of the paper. And I think that now that newspapers are seeing how many readers there are online and how much sport is a massive part of readership, then I feel that it's just being recognised as a massive part of journalism, and therefore the serious issues that there are, whether it's Jose Mourinho not recognising the importance of having a doctor treat someone who's injured, and possibly because she's a woman, or an incident of racism, which is nothing like as serious as an incident of racism that might be happening on the street, but is so massively amplified because it's happening on the sports field, of which there is so much interest. And again, it's global interest in English sports, in British sports, particularly in football. Obviously, it's absolutely massive. So the journalism, as Rob was saying, for these reporters, you know, like I know that obviously the local Manchester United and City reporters that Rob's referring to, Dave McDonald on the Mirror and R. Jamie Jackson, and you know, they're really good journalists who know their patch, and they're getting read worldwide because there's worldwide interest in the sport. So whatever issue it is, so whether it's just the entertainment of the game itself, the matches, the people, the personalities, the interviews, or it's a serious incident that's happened or a serious issue, it's just a huge part of journalism now. I think because it's just recognised how popular and how much integral to people's lives it is, sport.
Sure. Okay, before we go to questions, we'll just lighten it a little bit and talk about the Rugby World Cup, which, well, maybe that may not be lightening at all, actually, but it's very interesting. I wrote a book about the history of the Rugby World Cup and went right back to 1987 and talked to all the people involved with the World Cup then, and it was fascinating. They were just drunk all the way through it. They arrived in Auckland wearing Gorbachev masks and just sort of staggering around in a drunken stupor, and then Brian Moore said to me, they went and saw the New Zealand team training, and he said he remembers going, oh, they've got matching tracksuits and everything, because they just had, that was the level of amateurism. And obviously it's gone such a long way there. When you track through the World Cup since, it's an incredible story about the progression of a sport. And you look at the performances on the field and how much it's all improved, and then obviously this year it all comes crashing down and has been all rather dismal. But starting with you then, David, who do you think is going to win the World Cup?
Are England not going to win the World Cup?
England are going to really struggle to win the World Cup this time.
I don't think England are going to win the World Cup. It's
Yeah.
all to do with like not kicking a penalty. You know, the margins between success and disaster.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Because it's being written as if it's a complete disaster. But if they'd taken that kick instead of trying to play for touch and scored it, they would be through, wouldn't they, to the knockout phase. And I think the margin between success and failure and what's termed disaster can be very, very fine. But from what I can see, talking about New Zealand, they just look exceptionally scary, which, in rugby, I don't know that much about modern rugby. I used to love the old amateur era because I thought there was more space on the field and you had more people running. Now, when they're all so scary and there's no room, it seems to be who are the scariest. That seems to be who wins at rugby, and New Zealand definitely seem to be the scariest, so I think they're going to win it.
Okay, on the ground, how big the scariest, New Zealand?
I think it's going to be Australia. I just think they've been the most impressive. I haven't watched every match, but from what I've seen, they've been, especially in that Wales game, the defensive display with 13 men, with that onslaught, and you thought that every time they went, you thought Wales were going to score, and they somehow. Held them at bay. It was extremely impressive. If that was them with two of their guys not even on the pitch, on the field, then I think they're looking good.
And what about when they come up against the scary All Blacks?
I mean, it'd be a great match, but I think they're going to do what we did out there in 2003. I think they're going to win it on English soil.
Okay, Gareth.
Yeah, I'm going Australia as well. Like you say, brilliant last week, and they've got the right people in the right positions. This incredible back row, and great pack, which we didn't know they had at the beginning of the Rugby World Cup.
They brought in an Argentinian player to work with the pack and have done a lot of work on it.
I mean, I'd love Wales to get through and play them in the final, but Wales were crocked right now. I think it'll be Australia as well.
Who do you think, Alison?
Oh, God. I think it will be New Zealand. It's very hard to say. Has anyone any questions they'd like to ask? Okay, who thinks New Zealand will win the World Cup? There is a question.
Can you tell us a great story, which we can tell in the pubs, that hasn't been published?
A great story for you to tell.
Yeah, a nice, concise 5-minute story, 2-minute story that we can tell in the pubs, pass off as our own.
Right. Okay, well, I'm not going first, so who wants to start with that one?
I couldn't quite, you wanted a story to pass off as your own in the pub? Yeah, okay. That's got you written all over it, Gareth. This is a good little story, isn't it?
Yeah, well, it's a lot of them. And the truth is, the best stories you never publish, and that is the truth, because if you want to get close to people in the sports you cover, you find out things about them that you will never publish, because you've got private lives, you've got a private life, you've all got private lives, and we all do things that we wouldn't really want in the paper. Unfortunately, some people have to suffer. I'm trying to pick one. I'm not going to do it. I'm going to jib out, actually, because...
I'll decide.
Yeah, you do one.
I went to a barbecue party at Clive Woodward's house, and we were all there in the garden chatting, and then Clive walked in, and he was all made up, his makeup on, and they'd got kind of a bit of colour in his cheeks, and he walked around talking, and you could see everybody sort of saying, "Is he wearing makeup? He's wearing makeup," and spent the whole time, and then he went through around the sort of side where there was this big mirror on the wall. And you heard this scream, and then him run inside, and he'd come straight from the TV studios and left all the TV makeup on and spent the whole party with a full face of makeup. So that was all rather amusing.
Right, that's your one story then. You can tell that one in the pub.
Let's move swiftly on here.
I can't tell some of them, you see, in public.
Yeah.
All the ones I can think of, I can't recount.
And I do try to write any stories that I've got, so I can't think of any that I've never told.
Well, I think you've told us lots of amazing stories this morning, so I'd really like you all to thank Alison, David, Gareth and Rob for an amazing sports panel. Thank you so much.